On the cold morning of December 13, 1945, a young woman of just 22 walked slowly toward the gallows inside Hameln prison in Germany. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the narrow corridors that had already witnessed so many final walks before hers. She wore a plain gray dress, her blonde hair neatly set in place, and her face showed nothing. No fear, no regret, no visible emotion. Her name was Irma Grese, and within only a few minutes, she would go down in history as the youngest woman executed under British law for war crimes. But this isn't only about her last moments. It's about how a regular German farm girl transformed into one of the most infamous female war criminals the world had ever seen. The execution chamber itself was bare and practical, built for one single purpose. The British hangman Albert Pierre Point, who by then had carried out over 200 executions of Nazi war criminals, later said that Grace was the only one who walked to her death completely calm. She turned down the blindfold that was offered to her, fixed her eyes straight ahead, and when asked for her last words, she simply said, "Schnell," quickly. At 10:03 that morning, the trapdoor opened, and in less than 20 seconds, the woman survivors had nicknamed the Beautiful Beast was gone. But to understand why her death was met with relief and even celebration, we have to go back to the beginning. History often remembers monsters differently when they are young and female. Irma Grese forces us to question what evil looks like. She wasn't a scarred soldier or a hardened killer shaped by years of crime. She was barely out of her teenage years when she held command in Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest killing machine the world has ever known. Her victims numbered in the thousands. And yet she never fought on a battlefield or drew up military strategies. Her weapons were simpler, a whip, a pistol, and an authority that allowed her to send people to their deaths with just a wave of her hand. The Germany that shaped Irma Grese was a land broken by defeat and weighed down by chaos. The 1920s and 30s were years of humiliation, where the nation was crushed by hyperinflation, political instability, and the deep need to find someone to blame. Out of this chaos rose the Nazi Party, offering quick and clear answers to complicated problems and always finding scapegoats for every national failure. For young people like Irma, born in 1923, this world was the only one they knew. Instability, propaganda, and the enticing dream of national pride and greatness. What makes Irma's story even more disturbing is how ordinary her roots were. She wasn't born into wealth or power. Her father was a dairy farmer in Rechlin, a small village in Mecklenburg. The house she grew up in still exists today, just a modest farmhouse that gives no clue about the darkness that would later grow inside one of its children. Neighbors at the time recalled the Grese kids as quiet and not particularly remarkable, though many noticed that after their mother's suicide in 1936, they seemed more withdrawn. The shift from an ordinary village girl to a war criminal wasn't sudden. It was a slow, step-by-step process, built from indoctrination, opportunity, and the choices she made. Each step would have felt reasonable to someone living in that time. Joining the League of German Girls, adopting the Nazi worldview, looking for work in a system that rewarded loyalty over conscience. By the time Irma Grese first put on the uniform at Ravensbrück concentration camp, she had already traveled a path many other German youth had taken. The difference was just how far she was willing to push it. Historians still argue whether people like Irma Grese were born with cruelty inside them, or whether it was shaped and drawn out by their environment. The uncomfortable truth is that it was probably both. The Nazi system didn't magically invent monsters from thin air. It spotted people with certain tendencies and gave them unprecedented power to act on their darkest urges. In Irma Grese, they found someone whose appetite for cruelty was greater than even they had imagined. Looking at photos of her today, what strikes us is how normal she looked. She could have been anyone's daughter, sister, or neighbor. Her face was ordinary except for her youth. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the exact features the Nazis held up as the perfect Aryan ideal. And that ordinariness is maybe the most chilling detail. Because evil doesn't always come wrapped in an obvious disguise. Sometimes it wears a familiar face, one you could pass on the street without a second glance. Her fall into darkness didn't begin with any dramatic moment. It began with small, everyday choices and compromises. Irma Grese was born on October 7, 1923, the third of 5 children in a family that knew far more pain than comfort. Her father, Alfred Grese, joined the Nazi Party in 1937, though neighbors described him as more of a passive member than a devoted follower. Her mother, Berta, struggled with mental illness, and when Irma was only 13 years old, tragedy struck in the most brutal way. Berta drank hydrochloric acid, ending her life in a death so agonizing that it scarred the entire family. That single act tore open a wound that would never heal, shaping the course of Irma's own life. The suicide of Berta Grese was a turning point for young Irma. With her mother gone, her father remarried, bringing home a stepmother who showed little care for the children. Irma, caught in this cold household, went searching for belonging elsewhere. She found it in the League of German Girls, the female wing of the Hitler Youth. Here, in place of family warmth, she was given discipline, order, and the feeling that she was part of something far greater than herself. It was in this group that she first learned to march in step, to obey orders without hesitation, and, most dangerously, to see certain groups of people as less than human. Her school records from Reschland show nothing remarkable. She was an average student, neither particularly bright nor noticeably troubled. Teachers remembered her as quiet, distant, and unmemorable. At 14, she left formal education altogether. She tried to study nursing, perhaps hoping to enter a profession of care and healing, but she was rejected. That rejection, so small on the surface, turned out to have consequences that would ripple outward in the most horrific ways. Shut out of nursing, she would eventually walk into its opposite, not saving lives but destroying them. By 1940, at 17, Irma was working on a dairy farm, following her father's trade. But war changes everything, and for young women in Nazi Germany, new doors were opening. The Reich needed loyal servants. Posters and notices began to appear, calling for women to take up positions as concentration camp guards. The pay was good, the accommodation secure, and the work was framed as service to the fatherland. The ads didn't mention what those duties really were. Many who applied thought they would be doing office work or overseeing labor details. But Irma's path was leading somewhere far darker. Her application was accepted in 1942, and she was sent to Ravensbrück, the main training ground for female concentration camp guards, located just north of Berlin. Ravensbrück was both a prison and a school for brutality. Here, women were taught not just how to handle weapons or control prisoners, but how to reshape their minds. Indoctrination drilled into them the belief that inmates were not human beings, but enemies of the state, undeserving of mercy. The change in Irma was shocking. Witnesses who had known her before and after training said she became almost unrecognizable. The shy farm girl disappeared. In her place stood someone who carried herself with authority, who moved with confidence bordering on arrogance. She had found her role, and it was one of power, dominance, and control. Among the 2,000 women who would eventually serve as concentration camp guards, Irma was still just another recruit at first, learning the routine of roll calls, punishments, and selections. She watched the senior guards beat prisoners for the smallest mistakes, deny them food, strip them of dignity. Instead of recoiling from this cruelty, she embraced it. The violence did not repel her, it shaped her. Then, in March 1943, came the transfer that would define her. Irma Grese was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the sprawling death camp in occupied Poland, where the machinery of genocide operated at its most efficient. At 19 years old, she was about to step into a place where the line between life and death was nothing more than a gesture, a glance, a decision made in seconds. Normal rules no longer applied. Humanity itself had been dismantled, and in that environment, someone like Irma could thrive in ways that still haunt history. Auschwitz-Birkenau was unlike anything she had seen at Ravensbrück. This was not just a prison. It was death on an industrial scale. Trains arrived every day, crammed with Jewish families from all across Europe. On the arrival ramp, selections decided who would be sent straight to the gas chambers and who would be worked until they collapsed. The air carried the constant smoke of burning bodies, the sky itself darkened by it. And into this abyss walked a young woman who would soon become feared even among the most brutal SS men. At first, she was placed in charge of the women's camp. But it wasn't long before her superiors noticed something about her, an eagerness, an energy, a willingness to embrace her role with a disturbing kind of joy. While other guards carried out their orders with detachment or even hesitation, Irma appeared to take genuine pleasure in the power she wielded. She carried a braided cellophane whip that became her signature weapon, and her heavy boots left bruises and broken bones wherever she struck. Survivors later described her as always immaculate, uniform crisp, boots polished, hair perfectly styled. Surrounded by starvation, filth, and despair, she looked every bit the picture of Nazi pride. And from this place of power, she began to build the reputation that would make her one of the most infamous figures of the Holocaust. Daily life at Auschwitz gave Irma Grese endless opportunities to inflict pain, and she seized them all. The morning roll calls dragged on for hours, no matter the weather, burning heat, freezing snow, or pounding rain. Prisoners stood trembling as she moved among them, her whip cutting through the silence. A glance in the wrong direction, a slouched posture, or simply nothing at all could earn a vicious strike across the face. Sometimes she beat women because they looked at her, other times because they didn't. The violence was so random that it became its own form of terror. No one could predict what might trigger her fury, and that uncertainty broke spirits as effectively as the whip broke skin. But it was during the selections for the gas chambers that Grese showed the full depth of her cruelty. These selections were moments of absolute power. Lines of prisoners standing under the watchful eyes of SES doctors and guards, their fates decided with a flick of the hand. Grese threw herself into this role with enthusiasm. Survivors remembered how she would sometimes overrule the doctors, sending younger, healthier women to their deaths simply because she disliked them, or because they were too attractive in her eyes. Jealousy twisted into judgment, and judgment became a death sentence. Olga Lengyel, one survivor, wrote of how Grese would deliberately stand where new arrivals could see her, blonde, youthful, healthy, so that the doomed would notice the contrast between their desperate state and her polished appearance. She seemed to thrive on their pleading, their attempts to hide children, their cries for mercy. Another survivor, Dr. Gisela Pearl, who had been forced to work as a prisoner doctor, testified that Grese paid particular attention to pregnant women, ensuring they were sent either to the gas chambers or to the hands of doctors conducting medical experiments. Her beauty against her brutality gave her the chilling nickname, the Beautiful Beast. She was only 20, younger than many of the women she tormented, yet her youth only made her violence harder to comprehend. Survivors struggled to reconcile the normal-looking young woman with the acts of sadism she committed daily. How could someone who looked so ordinary, so almost familiar, be capable of such inhuman evil? This contradiction haunted them long after liberation. By the summer of 1943, her rise was already swift. She had been promoted to Oberaufseherin, senior overseer, the second highest position a woman could hold in the camp. At not even 21, she held authority over 30,000 female prisoners and dozens of other guards. At an age when most young women were dreaming of families, Irma Grese controlled life and death. Her tools were simple, but in her hands they became terrifying. The whip was her signature, a braided cellophane cord specially made for her. Survivors said they could recognize her victims immediately. The wounds had a distinct pattern, the skin split cleanly from her precise strikes. She took pride in her aim, in the way one lash could cripple a body. The dogs were another weapon. She trained them to attack on command, setting them loose on prisoners for entertainment. Women were ripped apart while she stood by, sometimes laughing, sometimes calmly directing the animal to be more vicious. Isabella Leitner, another survivor, recalled how Grese would force prisoners to remain perfectly still as her dog circled them, knowing any small flinch would trigger an attack. And then there was her pistol. Not all female guards carried one, but Grese had earned the privilege. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of her authority. Survivors remembered her pressing the barrel against their heads during interrogations, or firing shots near them simply to watch them flinch in panic. The constant fear of when she might actually pull the trigger was its own kind of torture, worse than death itself. But her most terrifying weapon was not one you could see, it was her control over selections. As a senior overseer, she had a powerful voice in deciding who lived and who died. Her choices were often cruelly personal. Someone too pretty, too weak, too defiant, or simply unlucky enough to catch her attention might be sent to the gas chambers. Food was another form of power in her hands. In a place where hunger ruled everything, she knew exactly how to exploit it. She would throw scraps on the ground and watch starving women claw at each other for them. Sometimes she destroyed food in front of the starving, punishing them with hunger itself. Her cruelty went further still. She ordered humiliating body searches that stripped prisoners naked in freezing cold, leaving them exposed for hours. Mothers were forced to stand bare in front of their children, broken in spirit as much as in body. In some cases, she forced mothers to choose which of their children would live, a twisted game that scarred survivors forever. And though she did not conduct experiments herself, she helped fuel them. She selected women for sterilizations, hypothermia trials, or worse, often telling them they were being taken for special treatment. Survivors knew that phrase was nothing more than a lie, one that led only to agony. Perhaps the most terrifying part of Irma Grese was her unpredictability. Some guards could be bribed. Others, on occasion, showed flashes of humanity. But Grese was consistent in her cruelty and random in her violence. No pattern, no safety, no way to avoid her. The uncertainty itself broke prisoners, leaving them in a constant state of dread that gnawed away at their sanity as surely as the starvation wasted their bodies. By 1944, as the Red Army pushed closer to Auschwitz, the machinery of death accelerated to its peak. Trains arrived from Hungary in endless waves packed with families. The gas chambers ran day and night, filling the skies with smoke that darkened the horizon. And in this apocalyptic setting, Irma Grese seemed to grow even more extreme. as if she sensed her reign of power would not last forever. She poured herself into violence with renewed energy, desperate to exploit every last moment. Survivors from this time describe scenes that feel almost impossible to believe. Grese would line up prisoners for hours, forcing them to stand frozen while she moved through them, selecting women for punishment or death. She invented sadistic games, promising to spare one woman's life if she could stand motionless while others were whipped beside her. Any flinch, any tear, any reflex of compassion, and the chosen woman too would be beaten. This was not random cruelty anymore. It was psychological warfare, breaking human empathy itself. The women's orchestra at Auschwitz, forced to play as prisoners, marched, or as selections took place, became another tool for her. The sound of violins and flutes filled the air while she ordered beatings, as though she were staging a grotesque performance. Irma Grese, the orchestra's conductor before her death, tried desperately to shield her musicians from Grese's attention, knowing that even catching her eye could be fatal. After Grose's passing, survivors said Grese seemed to focus even more on tormenting the women in the orchestra, as though their music only fueled her appetite for cruelty. And then there were the children. For most, Auschwitz meant death the moment they stepped off the train. But some children, twins chosen for Mengelé's experiments, or those whose mothers were still needed for labor, remained in the camp. Grese seemed to take particular joy in tormenting them. Survivors remembered her mocking their cries, punishing mothers who tried to shield them, making the weakest feel utterly helpless. One incident seared itself into the memory of many witnesses. A newborn baby had been hidden by a group of women, desperate to give it a chance at life. When Grese discovered the infant, she didn't simply send it to the gas chamber. She forced the mother to watch as she disposed of the child herself, then savagely beat the mother and the women who had tried to help. The message was unmistakable. Compassion itself would be destroyed. Any spark of humanity would be stamped out under her boot. Her cruelty often carried a sexual edge. Survivors described how she targeted young, attractive women, subjecting them to strip searches, humiliating beatings aimed at their most private places, and degrading torments designed to crush their dignity. Some historians believe her own sexuality played a role in this violence, though the truth may never be fully known. What is certain is that she wielded sexual humiliation as a weapon, leaving wounds that went deeper than the body. Rumors swirled among prisoners and SS alike about her relationships with other officers. She was said to have been involved with Dr. Josef Mengele and even with Camp Commandant Rudolf Höss. No one could say with certainty whether these were true relationships or simply another form of power in the SS hierarchy. But survivors noted one chilling detail. After these encounters, her violence often grew worse, as though she needed to prove her cruelty to her male colleagues or to herself. As the summer of 1944 bled into autumn, the Reich began to cover its tracks. Crematoria were blown up, records destroyed, evidence burned. But Irma Grese did not relent. If anything, she became more volatile, her cruelty sharper, as though she were trying to kill as many as possible before her world collapsed. Survivors described her as unpredictable and unhinged, a storm of rage that struck without warning. When the evacuation orders came, she was there, selecting who would be forced onto the death marches and who would be left behind to die. Thousands of prisoners, weakened by starvation and disease, were driven out into the freezing winter, stumbling across snow-covered roads that soon became littered with bodies. Anyone too weak to keep up was shot where they fell. Those who slowed down to help others were beaten or executed. Grese watched over these columns of women with the same merciless cruelty she had shown inside Auschwitz, ensuring that even on the road, death marched beside them. The final days of her reign were soaked in misery. In January 1945, as Soviet artillery thundered in the distance, she abandoned Auschwitz with the other SS personnel. Behind her lay a mountain of corpses, the ashes of thousands, and the broken survivors who had somehow endured her hand. Ahead of her stretched a collapsing Reich, chaos on every road, and the false hope that she might still escape the reckoning she had earned. The evacuation of Auschwitz was a crime in itself. Around 60,000 prisoners were forced onto the frozen roads of Poland, driven westward in the dead of winter. With little food, no shelter, and the constant threat of execution, thousands collapsed and died along the way. Snow drifts swallowed bodies, ditches filled with the fallen. And Irma Grese was there, overseeing one of the columns of women, her cruelty unchanged by the march. Survivors remembered how she shot those who lagged behind, beat anyone who tried to help the weak, and made examples out of those who stumbled. The death camp followed its prisoners into the snow, carried forward by the guards who refused to let the killing stop. After endless days of suffering, Grese and her prisoners arrived at Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany. If Auschwitz had been organized death, Belsen was pure chaos. Built to hold 10,000, the camp now suffocated under more than 60,000 starving, diseased bodies. There was no food. Water was scarce. Sanitation was non-existent. Typhus spread like fire through the barracks, and corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Into this nightmare, Grace delivered her exhausted women. At Belsen, she was given the title of labor commander. Her duty was to organize work details, though in truth, most of the prisoners were too sick, too weak, too broken to labor at all. The camp had no gas chambers, no systematic killing operations. Here, death came through starvation, disease, and neglect. And yet Greece carried her violence with her, as though unable to exist without it. Witnesses recalled how she continued to beat prisoners who could barely stand, striking the dying as if trying to hold on to the authority that was slipping away with every passing day. On April 15, 1945, the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen. What they found shocked even soldiers hardened by years of war. 13,000 unburied corpses lay scattered across the campgrounds. Thousands more were still dying, their skeletal bodies too weak to survive even rescue. The stench of death choked the air, clinging to uniforms and skin. Richard Dimbleby of the BBC, reporting from the camp, struggled to put words to what he saw. His broadcasts carried the horror across the world, making it impossible to deny the scale of Nazi atrocities. When the British entered, Irma Grese was still there, still in uniform, still trying to project authority. She made no attempt to hide among the prisoners or to escape into the chaos. Instead, she identified herself to the soldiers as SS Oberoffizierin Grese and awaited arrest. What struck the British most was her demeanor, calm, almost indifferent, as if the apocalyptic scene around her was nothing unusual. The British forced Grese and the other SS guards to face what they had created. They made them bury the dead with their own hands, carrying corpses bloated with disease, laying them into mass graves. Photographs captured Grese doing this work, stripped of her uniform, dressed in plain civilian clothes, her face as expressionless as ever. Survivors who watched felt a bitter mix of emotions. Some felt satisfaction, seeing their tormentors finally touch the death they had dealt so freely. Others felt anger that these guards still breathed while so many innocents did not. And some felt only emptiness, because nothing, not even justice, could undo the horrors they had endured. In her first interrogations, Grese clung to the defense that would echo through countless trials. She had only followed orders. She denied the cruelty survivors described. She claimed she remembered little. She admitted her presence but refused to own her actions. British interrogators noted her lack of emotion. As witness after witness confronted her deeds, she sat unmoved, no flicker of guilt crossing her face. Journalists arriving at Belsen were captivated by her. How could this young woman, only 21 years old, have taken part in such mass slaughter? Photographs showed a figure that could have been any ordinary girl, yet survivors spoke of her as one of the cruelest guards of all. She became a symbol of what the Nazi system had done to an entire generation, turning ordinary youth into executioners without remorse. And soon she would stand trial for it all. The Belsen trial began on September 17, 1945 in Lüneburg, inside a converted gymnasium-turned-courtroom. 45 defendants stood accused of war crimes, and among them, Irma Grese drew the most attention. She was the youngest. She was one of only 16 women, and according to the survivors, she was among the most sadistic. The world's press crowded into the small town, their eyes fixed on this unlikely figure who embodied the cruelty of the camps. This trial would become one of the first great reckonings of the Nazi nightmare, a precursor to Nuremberg itself. The prosecution, led by Colonel T.M. Backhouse, faced a daunting task. How do you prove individual guilt inside a system built to spread responsibility so thin that no single person could be held accountable? The crimes were massive in scope, the evidence overwhelming in scale, but the specifics mattered. Who gave the order? Who pulled the trigger? Who chose who lived and who died? The court's strategy was clear: build the case around specific acts of cruelty that could be tied to particular defendants. And in Greece, they found a target whose crimes survivors could recount in chilling detail. One by one, survivors took the stand. Dr. Ada Bimko, a Polish Jewish physician forced to serve in the camp hospital, testified that Grese had beaten women so severely that their injuries required treatment she could not provide. She spoke of selections where Grese sent hundreds to their deaths, of punishments so vicious that women were left permanently disabled, of the casual cruelty that marked her authority. Another witness, Judith Stein, told of a day when Grese set her dogs on a group of women, standing by as the animals tore into their flesh. When asked in court to identify her tormentor, Stein pointed directly at the young woman in the dock. The air in the courtroom shifted in that moment. Survivor and oppressor face to face. The balance of power finally reversed. Yet Grese sat unmoved, her gaze fixed forward, betraying no reaction. The testimonies revealed not just random violence but patterns of cruelty. Witnesses described her particular hatred for Polish women, her obsession with humiliating mothers in front of their children, her sexualized punishments. Their stories aligned, independent accounts echoing the same horrors. The prosecution also presented evidence of her swift promotions, proof of how eagerly she embraced her role in the machinery of extermination. When the time came for Grese to take the stand on October 16, 1945, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Through an interpreter, she tried to paint herself as an ordinary young woman, swept up in events beyond her control. She admitted being present at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, but denied the specific acts of cruelty described. Over and over, she claimed survivors had mistaken her for others. Her defense was simple. Yes, I was there, but no, it was not me. But under cross-examination, the cracks began to show. When asked about selections, she admitted being present, but insisted she had no authority to decide who lived or died. The prosecution then produced SS records proving her rank and responsibilities. When asked about her whip, she admitted carrying it but claimed it was for self-defense. The gallery erupted in gasps. Survivors in attendance had lived through its sting, the wounds still etched into their flesh. Her lawyer, Major LSW Cranfield, faced an impossible task. How do you defend someone when so many survivors, from different times and places, all told the same story of cruelty? His strategy was to argue that Grese had been indoctrinated, that she was young, that disobedience might have cost her life. But these arguments crumbled when compared to survivor testimony describing her exceeding even the expectations of the SS, showing a zeal for violence beyond her orders. Day after day, more evidence piled up. Survivors stood, pointed, and told their truths. They spoke of whips and dogs, of humiliations and murders, of the beautiful young woman who had shown them no mercy. The prosecution laid out photographs from Bergen-Belsen, mountains of corpses, pits of unburied dead, proof of what her service had enabled. And through it all, Grese remained impassive, her expression unreadable, her face a mask that betrayed nothing of the horror described around her. By November, the case was overwhelming. Survivor after survivor had confirmed the same details. Each scar, each broken memory pointed back to her. The defense had little left to offer but the tired refrain. She was only following orders. The judges, hardened military men, listened with discipline. The world waited to hear their verdict. On November 16, 1945, after 2 months of testimony, the court finally reached its verdict. The room was silent as Major General H.M.P. Bernie Ficklin, presiding judge, read through the decisions with military precision. Irma Grese stood at attention, as if still on parade. When her name was called, the words fell heavy. Guilty of war crimes, guilty of murder, guilty of ill treatment of Allied nationals. Observers noted she showed no visible reaction, no tears, no collapse, not even the faintest flicker of emotion. She wore the same blank mask she had worn throughout the trial, as though nothing could pierce her detachment. Now came the question of punishment. For crimes of this magnitude, there were only 2 options: life imprisonment or death. The prosecution argued her age was no defense, but rather an aggravating factor. At 21, she had chosen cruelty with eagerness, had embraced violence with zeal. She could not claim ignorance. She had not been too young to understand that beating women to death was wrong, nor too innocent to grasp what selections meant. Youth had not softened her, it had sharpened her cruelty. The defense tried one last desperate plea for mercy. They spoke of her broken childhood, her mother's suicide, her indoctrination from a young age. They argued that executing a 22-year-old woman would strip the Allies of moral high ground, making them no different from the Nazis. They begged the court to recognize her as a product of a system rather than an architect of evil. But these words rang hollow in the face of testimony from those who had stood before her whip, those who had seen her smile while sending mothers and children to their deaths. Survivors who sat in the courtroom had been younger than Grace when she tormented them. Some had been children when she ordered their parents beaten, starved, or executed. To them, her youth was not a shield, but a reminder of what she had chosen, while others in the same generation had chosen humanity. On November 17, 1945, the sentence was delivered. Death by hanging. Irma Grese heard her fate without flinching, without protest, without visible regret. She stood erect as if still in uniform, listening with the same emotionless composure she had carried since her arrest. Alongside her, two other women, Elizabeth Volkenrath and Juana Bormann, were also condemned. Together, they would become some of the first women in history executed for war crimes. The sentence required confirmation from higher military authorities, triggering a 4-week pause as appeals were considered and swiftly rejected. During this waiting period, Irma was held in Hameln prison, the same prison where her life would soon end. Guards who watched over her reported she showed no signs of fear or remorse. She spent her time reading, writing letters, and carefully maintaining her appearance, as if preparing for another day at the camp rather than the end of her life. She refused spiritual counsel, rejected confession, and held firm to her claim that she had only ever done her duty. Psychologists examined her in those weeks, searching for signs of guilt, cracks in her resolve, some hint of humanity beneath the cold exterior. What they found disturbed them even more. She was intelligent, articulate, and utterly lacking in empathy. No remorse, no reflection, no recognition of the suffering she had caused. The cruelty described by survivors seemed not to haunt her at all. For the British, there was a delicate problem to solve. How do you execute notorious war criminals without turning them into martyrs? The answer was to make the execution swift, quiet, and routine, following standard legal procedure with no spectacle. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner, was summoned for the task. A man known for his efficiency, he prided himself on carrying out hangings swiftly and cleanly. The irony was impossible to ignore. The woman who had prolonged the suffering of so many would herself be dispatched in seconds by a man who specialized in minimizing pain. The night before her appointed day, Irma was offered the customary last meal. She declined anything special, eating the same plain prison fare as always. She was given the chance to write a final statement. She penned a last letter to her father, the contents of which were never made public. When offered the chance for spiritual comfort, she again refused. Guards said she showed no outward distress, no panic, no desperate pleas for mercy. She lay down and slept through her final night as though tomorrow were nothing unusual. Beyond the prison walls, the world debated her fate. Some argued execution was too merciful for crimes so immense. Others worried about the precedent, executing women, even women guilty of such horrors. The Catholic Church even appealed for clemency, insisting that no soul was beyond redemption. But for the survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, there was no such debate. To them, she had forfeited her right to life long ago. Each lash of her whip, each selection, each scream in the night carving away any claim to mercy. And so the morning of her reckoning drew closer. December 13, 1945 arrived cold and gray over Hameln prison. At 6 in the morning, Irma Grese awoke to her final day on earth. The execution was scheduled for 10 o'clock, giving her only a few hours before the end. Prison officials later said she prepared with the same composure she had shown throughout her imprisonment. She dressed with care in a simple gray dress, arranged her blonde hair neatly, and ate a light breakfast. There were no tears, no collapse, no pleading, no signs of a woman facing the rope. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner, had arrived the previous day to make his preparations. He calculated her drop carefully, measuring her height and weight to ensure death would come instantly, with no struggle. Pierrepoint later wrote in his memoirs that, out of all the war criminals he executed, Irma Grese was the most composed. Where others had to be carried, she walked. Where others prayed or sobbed, she remained silent. She, who had once tormented helpless prisoners with random cruelty, now faced her own end with a chilling steadiness. At 9:30 a.m., she was led from her cell to the small holding area near the gallows. The offer of religious comfort was extended one last time. Again, she refused. Witnesses gathered, British military officials, a doctor to pronounce death, and representatives of the Allies. No journalists were allowed. The execution would be carried out swiftly, quietly, according to procedure. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened and Irma Grese stepped into the execution chamber. Pierrepoint noted how quickly she moved, almost eagerly, toward the gallows. When asked for her final words, she uttered only one: "Schnell!" Quickly, she refused the blindfold, choosing instead to face death with her eyes open. Pierre Point positioned her on the trapdoor. The rope was placed around her neck. For a moment, the chamber was still. Then the lever was pulled. The trap snapped open at 10:03 a.m., and in less than 20 seconds, the woman survivors had named the beautiful beast was dead. Her body remained hanging for the required hour before being cut down. It was laid into a plain coffin and buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds. The spot kept secret so it could never become a shrine for sympathizers. The execution itself lasted less than a minute, far shorter than the suffering she had inflicted on thousands. Survivors who heard of it later spoke of mixed emotions. Some felt relief that justice had been served. Others felt hollow. No rope, no gallows, could balance the scale of the horrors they had endured. Her death could not bring back the murdered, nor erase the scars left behind. News of the execution spread quickly across the world. British headlines read, "Nazi beast hanged." American papers focused on her youth, struggling to reconcile her age with the crime she had committed. In Germany, the reaction was quieter. The nation, drowning in its own guilt and ruins, had little sympathy for those who had been its most eager servants. For the survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, the knowledge of her death was complicated. Some felt a dark satisfaction that the woman who had tormented them with whip, pistol, and dogs now swung from the rope. Others felt cheated. Death was too quick, too merciful compared to what she had dealt out. And for many, there was only emptiness. No verdict, no sentence. No execution could return the families torn from them, the children lost, the lives shattered. Justice could punish one woman, but it could never undo what she had been part of. Yet her execution carved itself into history. It marked one of the first times a woman had been executed for war crimes under international law. It cemented the principle that "I was only following orders" was no defense against crimes against humanity. It reminded the world that individuals bore responsibility for their choices, even inside monstrous systems. On that cold December morning, in the silence of Hamon prison, the chapter of Irma Grese ended. A young woman who might have lived an ordinary life instead chose the path of cruelty, wielding power with sadistic pleasure until it was torn from her hands. She walked to her death with calm composure. But the echoes of her violence continued long after the rope went taut. For survivors, her face would forever remain a reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary mask, and sometimes it smiles. When word of the executions left Hamon prison that afternoon, it flashed across headlines around the globe. Newspapers screamed their judgment in bold print. In Britain, one tabloid declared, "Nazi beast hanged." American reporters focused on her youth, marveling at how someone so young could have embraced such monstrous cruelty. The contrast between her age and her crimes was too sharp for many to process. In Germany itself, the reaction was muted. The country lay shattered, cities reduced to rubble, people starving, a nation confronting the unbearable weight of its collective guilt. There was little sympathy left for those who had served most eagerly in the Reich's killing machine. For survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, the news carried emotions that defied easy explanation. Some felt a grim satisfaction to know that the woman who had beaten them, starved them, sent their families to the gas chambers had finally faced the rope, gave a measure of justice, however small. Others felt only emptiness. The rope could not return children lost on the ramp. It could not restore the voices silenced in the crematoria. It could not erase the scars carved into flesh and soul. For many, Grese's death was a moment of closure, but not of healing. Some survivors admitted to feeling cheated. Hanging was swift, clean, efficient. She had inflicted suffering measured in hours, days, months, beatings that left women broken, games that shattered their minds, selections that ripped families apart. Compared to that, her end had been too quick, too merciful. She had whispered "Schnell," and her request had been granted. Death had come in less than a minute, while her victims had known pain beyond words. Still, her execution carried weight beyond her own life. It was one of the first times in history that a woman was executed for war crimes. It shattered the idea that gender offered immunity, that youth excused cruelty. It set a precedent that the world would carry forward into future tribunals. Following orders is not a shield against judgment. The individual is responsible, no matter how vast the system, no matter how powerful the ideology. Her burial was deliberately anonymous. After the hanging, her body was placed in a plain coffin, lowered into an unmarked grave within the prison grounds. The location was kept secret, denied even to her family. The authorities feared her resting place might become a shrine for Nazi loyalists, a rallying point for the poisonous ideology she had served. Instead, her remains vanished into obscurity. Just another body in the ground. No gravestone, no marker, no place for remembrance. She was denied the dignity she had denied thousands. Yet her image did not vanish. Photographs of her at trial circulated worldwide. Her youthful face, her neat hair, her impassive expression. People struggled to reconcile the girl in those photos with the testimonies of unimaginable cruelty. Could someone so ordinary-looking truly have become one of the most feared women of the camps? That contradiction haunted the public. It reminded them that evil did not always wear a monstrous mask. Sometimes it looked like the girl next door. For historians, her story became a warning. She had not been born into power, nor raised to rule. She was a farmer's daughter from a small village, a girl marked more by tragedy than by privilege. Yet step by step, choice by choice, she had walked into the heart of the Reich's killing machine. Indoctrination shaped her, opportunity tempted her, and cruelty grew inside her until it consumed everything else. She proved that ordinary beginnings could still lead to extraordinary evil. And for the survivors, her memory remained sharper than any headline. They remembered the whip whistling through the air. They remembered the dogs, the pistol, the selections. They remembered her boots clicking on the ramp, her eyes scanning them like cattle. They remembered the calm with which she inflicted pain, the blankness that followed screams. Even after her body swung at Hameln, those memories lived on. Justice had spoken, but justice was not enough. The execution of Irma Grese was more than the end of one life. It was a moment carved into history, one that forced the world to look at evil not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing human face. For the first time, a woman stood before an international tribunal and was executed for war crimes. Her hanging at Hameln set a precedent that echoed far beyond the prison walls. It declared with finality that there would be no safe harbor for those who participated in mass murder, no excuse strong enough to wash away blood willingly spilled. The principle was clear. I was only following orders, would never again serve as a shield. The Nazi regime had thrived on that lie, a system designed to blur responsibility, to make every crime seem like the work of someone else. But in the end, the courts cut through that illusion. Every lash of the whip, every snap of the dog's teeth, every name marked for death in a selection, those choices belonged to individuals, and those individuals would answer for them. Grese's case shattered more than legal defenses. It also broke cultural assumptions. For centuries, women had been imagined as nurturers, incapable of cruelty equal to men. But here was a young woman, barely in her 20s, who had embraced sadism with zeal, who had become more feared than many of her male counterparts. Her story forced the world to admit that evil had no gender, that violence and cruelty could take root in anyone. The press struggled with this. American and British newspapers lingered on her youth, her appearance, her blonde hair and blue eyes. They marveled at how someone who looked like a neighbor's daughter could be called the beautiful beast. They printed her photos beside the words of survivors who described the sting of her whip, the bark of her dogs, the shrieks of children torn from their mothers. The contradiction unsettled readers because it revealed a truth far more terrifying than the caricature of a monster. It showed that monstrosity could hide in plain sight. In Germany, the silence was heavier. The nation was drowning in ruins, trying to bury both its dead and its shame. Few openly mourned Grese. Fewer still defended her. She was too closely tied to the image of the camps, too closely linked to the horrors that could no longer be denied. Her grave was unmarked, her name spoken in whispers, her legacy one of infamy. For the survivors, her death was only a footnote to their own struggle. They left the courtrooms and the camps to search for family members who might still be alive, to rebuild lives shattered by starvation and loss, to carry scars that could never truly heal. Some admitted to dreaming of her even after hearing of her execution. In those dreams, she still walked among them with whip and pistol, her shadow refusing to die. Justice had ended her body, but memory kept her alive. Her trial, her verdict, and her execution became part of the foundation for international law. They influenced the Nuremberg trials that followed, shaping the principle that crimes against humanity would always carry personal responsibility. From that December morning in Hameln, the world took a step toward a fragile kind of justice, one written in the blood of millions, but carried forward in the hope that such horrors might never be repeated. Yet even as her story closed, its lessons lingered in a chilling way. Irma Grese was not extraordinary in her beginnings. She was not raised in privilege, not molded by wealth or power. She was ordinary, a farmer's daughter from a small village, a girl marked by personal tragedy, a young woman shaped by propaganda. Her life proved that evil did not always emerge in the grand halls of generals or dictators. Sometimes it sprouted in quiet homes, in broken families, in the heart of someone who looked like anyone else. And that was the true terror of her story. Not just what she did, but how possible it was for her to exist at all. The legacy of Irma Grese did not end with the tightening of the rope at Hamel. In many ways, her death only began a different story, one told in whispers, court records, and nightmares that survivors carried for decades. She became a symbol not just of cruelty, but of what happens when ordinary people surrender themselves to ideology and power. Her name lived on, not as a martyr, but as a warning. For survivors, her memory was etched into flesh and bone. Women who bore scars from her whip recognized the marks long after the war, a twisted signature burned into their skin. Some carried those scars like evidence, reminders of what they had endured and what they had seen. Others could not bear to speak of her at all, her image too bound to the screams and smoke of Auschwitz. Testimony in court had spoken her crimes aloud, but in private, the memories lingered in silence, haunting the quiet moments of life rebuilt. Historians dissected her case in the years that followed. Was she born with cruelty inside her, or was it carved into her by the world she lived in? Some argued her mother's suicide, her broken family, her rejection from nursing school created a void she filled with power and violence. Others insisted that plenty of Germans had suffered the same losses and temptations without becoming executioners. The truth lay somewhere in between. Greece had chosen, step by step, to embrace cruelty. Each lash, each command, each act of humiliation was not an accident of circumstance, but a decision. What made her story so disturbing was not only what she did, but how ordinary she had appeared while doing it. She had not been a hardened soldier scarred by combat. She had not been an older zealot burned by years of fanaticism. She was young, healthy, attractive, an image that Nazi propaganda could hold up as the Aryan ideal. And yet, behind that mask of youth and beauty lurked sadism that left seasoned survivors shaken. The contradiction became part of her infamy. She was proof that evil could smile, that it could wear polished boots in a pressed uniform, that it could hide behind blonde hair and blue eyes. Her execution did not erase this contradiction. Instead, it sealed it in history. Photographs of her at trial, standing calmly as accusations swirled around her, became lasting images. They appeared in books, in reports, in archives. For many who looked at them later, the photos carried a chilling question. How many others, just as ordinary in appearance, had been capable of the same cruelty but escaped justice? International law carried her shadow too. The Belsen trial, where she faced her accusers, helped establish the principle that crimes against humanity required personal accountability. No one could hide behind orders or point to superiors as shields. Each individual bore responsibility. Greece's youth, her gender, her ordinary background, none of it excused her actions. Her trial became one of the building blocks for future tribunals, shaping how the world would confront genocide again and again in the decades that followed. But for those who survived her, law and precedent were not enough. In testimonies given years later, some spoke of hearing her voice in their dreams. They remembered her whispering "Schnell" in the death chamber, and it echoed against memories of her voice at roll calls, barking commands, sending families to their end. For them, the gallows had silenced her body, but not her presence. She lingered in their minds as the embodiment of terror, proof that trauma does not end when the tormentor dies. In Germany, her grave remained unmarked, her memory buried in silence. Yet her story never disappeared. She surfaced in history books, in survivor memoirs, in documentaries and trials. Not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as an eternal warning of what humanity is capable of when conscience is surrendered. Her life forced the world to confront a terrible truth. Evil does not always arrive in monstrous form. Sometimes it comes dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, walking with confidence, smiling with pride. Sometimes it looks like the girl next door. The story of Irma Grese did not end at the gallows, nor in the unmarked grave where her body was lowered in silence. Her true legacy stretched far beyond that December morning. It lived on in the memories of survivors, in the court records of her trial, and in the shadow she cast over history. She became more than a single executioner. She became a symbol of what happens when ordinary people embrace extraordinary cruelty. The world remembers monsters differently when they are young, when they are female, when their faces do not match the horrors tied to their names. Grese's image unsettled because it clashed so violently with what she had done. Looking at her photographs, people saw a girl who could have been anyone's sister, anyone's daughter, anyone's neighbor. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a soft face untouched by age. Yet behind that face lay a record of sadism so brutal that survivors named her the Beautiful Beast. The contradiction itself became her legend. For those who endured Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, her memory was never abstract. It lived in scars, in nightmares, in stories told and retold across generations. They remembered her whip-cutting flesh with surgical precision. They remembered her dogs circling like predators, waiting for a nod. They remembered her pistol gleaming under the sun as she pressed it against their heads. They remembered the selections, when a glance from her eyes meant death. No matter how many years passed, those memories did not fade. Justice had ended her life, but not her presence in their minds. Historians continued to wrestle with her. Was she born cruel? Or did the Reich create her? Was she the inevitable product of propaganda? Or an individual who found in the system a chance to act out her darkest impulses? The answer was never simple. The Nazi regime had built a machine that rewarded brutality, but machines need operators. Grese had chosen to become one of its most willing. She could have turned away. She could have chosen differently. Others did, but she did not. And that choice defined her. Her case forced the world to accept that evil does not always look like evil. It can be young. It can be beautiful. It can be ordinary. The most haunting lesson of her life was not in the cruelty itself, but in how possible it was for someone so unremarkable to become its vessel. If Irma Grese could exist, then so could countless others, waiting only for the chance. International law carried her imprint. The trials where she stood exposed helped shape the principle that would echo for decades. Crimes against humanity would not be excused by obedience. Every guard, every officer, every participant would be held accountable for their own actions. Her youth had not protected her. Her gender had not protected her. The rope had waited all the same. For survivors, though, her death was never enough. It could not bring back the families taken on the ramp. It could not erase the terror of nights haunted by screams. It could not undo the scars that burned every time they remembered the whip. Justice could punish her, but justice could never balance the scale. Their lives carried the weight of what she had done, long after her body was gone. And for the world, her name became a reminder carved into history's darkest chapter. Irma Grese, the farmer's daughter who became a commandant of cruelty, the girl who could have been anyone, who instead became the embodiment of sadism. The Beautiful Beast. Her story lingers not because she was unique, but because she was not. She was proof that ordinary faces can hide the darkest shadows, that the capacity for cruelty lives not only in monsters, but in people who seem like us. That was the lesson left behind when the rope snapped in Hameln. A warning whispered across generations. Evil does not always scream. Sometimes it smiles.